Hello and welcome to Black Marriage Therapy, BMT for short. Here we become students of marriage in order to create healthy, long lasting relationships. I'm your host, Kristen Smith, and in today's episode, we discuss emotional intelligence and why it's necessary in marriage. So, specifically, what we have in store for you today is we are going to be explaining what emotional intelligence is. We are going to be talking about the negative or toxic ways we deal with our emotions. We're going to also be discussing why it's important for our personal lives and our marriage. And of course, how to gain a better level of emotional intelligence. Before we jump into that, if you have been enjoying the content, please follow us on Instagram at Black Marriage Therapy, rate us on your podcast platform, and share your favorite episode with a friend. We also have a unique opportunity for you to support this podcast monthly. All you have to do is go to our show notes and click the link to support this podcast. For as little as 99 cents per month, you could partner with us to continue to provide you with high quality content. Okay, I'm very excited to talk about this topic with you guys. Junior is not on this episode, but that is because we have something brewing specifically for the men. Oftentimes on this podcast, we let Junior just take over and talk about topics that's specifically for men in marriage. So I know that he's going to be doing something about anger and just emotional wellness for men. So stay tuned for that. But I want to lay a basic foundation about emotional intelligence. And this is more of like an individual thing that's going to benefit your marriage versus like a specific marital thing. As you've heard me say many times before on this podcast, your marriage is only as healthy as the individuals in it. So today we want to focus on you as an individual and your emotional intelligence. So, what is emotional intelligence? Let me tell you something. Don't Google this topic because I mean, of course I Googled it, right? But if you YouTube it, TikTok, Instagram, or whatever, I was very surprised that when I Googled this topic, it was very, very gendered. And there was a lot of people who had a lot of different opinions about it. And I was super surprised because I'm like, this is just like basic foundational stuff. Like, this is stuff like you teach toddlers, right? But some adults don't get that lesson. We're going to talk more about that. But I was very surprised at, how like, there were men talking about, well, women just want you to go on their emotional roller coaster, right? And then they were talking about how, oh, well, it's really about being in tune to other people's emotions and all these things. And I was just like, huh, okay, wasn't expecting this to be a hot button issue. To be honest, let's be honest. But when I Google it, that's definitely what I saw. So I just want you guys to be mindful that as you guys are learning about this topic, if you come across something that's a little crazy, put that down and listen to this whole episode, okay? Pick up a book because it's a little crazy out there. But emotional intelligence really starts with you. And the definition that I found that I liked was emotional intelligence, also known as emotional quotient or the EQ, is the ability to understand, manage, and use your own emotions in a positive way. That is the definition I got online, but my definition is similar but the same. So I like understand, but I would say emotional intelligence is about having the awareness of your emotions and understanding, being able to manage it, which is regulate them, right? But then also articulate them. And I think that's what they mean by use your emotions in a positive way. Can you actually speak those emotions? Can you actually communicate your emotions and use it in a way that's not destructive, right? That is how I would define emotional intelligence. And let's break the definition down piece by piece because each one of these pieces really is important for you to know. So the first thing I would say in the definition, it says you have to have a level of understanding to have emotional intelligence about your emotions. And I would add to that awareness. In order for you to have an emotional intelligence, you have to be able to be aware of your emotions in the first place. And this is where I find a lot of people get stuck. I mean, a lot of people get stuck on all these parts, but if you were anything like me and you grew up in a house where like emotions were suppressed and that wasn't the jam in your house, then you may not even know how to identify your emotions. You may be completely oblivious or unaware of your emotions, let alone understand them. In my household, strength was more important than whatever emotions you had. Resilience was more important than any emotion that you had. And I grew up in a Caribbean household, and the oppression and the struggles that come with coming from an immigrant family does not allow room for emotions. It's often like, hey, we don't have time to cry. We don't have time to be sad, anxious, depressed, or any of that. You have to push that aside and be strong. You have to be resilient. And I think the same could be true, of course, in the Black community, right? We have gone through slavery and oppression in this country. And even very recently, if you know what I'm talking about, like we are constantly lambasted with like oppression in this country. And when that's happening, you don't have a lot of room for emotions. There's no time for anxious, scared. Most of the time, our response is resilience and strength. Like we have to be able to gather together, be strong, keep moving forward, pay the bills, go to work, and show up as this person. But that is not human. It really is not human. And in order for us to even become aware, let alone us understand our emotion, we have to be able to stop and kind of let the emotions be, which can be very difficult depending on what type of person you are. And this process, or this part of the definition with awareness and understanding, it starts with honesty as well. You have to be able to be honest. There are certain emotions that, when you feel them, you just kind of feel ashamed, positive or negative. You feel ashamed, so you kind of want to push those emotions out of the way. And that's another reason why you can't even be aware of the emotions, because once you feel envy, once you feel jealousy, you're like, whoa, and you just push it away. You feel ashamed about it, and you're like, I'm not, or you feel, embarrassed or humiliated about it, and you're like, well, I can't address this. If you can't even be honest with your emotions, you're definitely going to have issues with having a higher level of emotional intelligence. And I'll give you a example, because I don't want people to think that we're only talking about negative emotions, right? Negative emotions are like your sadness, your anger, your anxiety, your fear, stuff like that. Positive emotions are like the joy, the happiness, the peace, confidence, all things, things like that. But you have to be honest with those negative emotions, but you have to be honest with those positive emotions. I have found that in my personal journey with emotional development, that even the positive emotions can like strike a response. For example, here's a little story for you guys. I grew up in a very churchy household, and we were taught abstinence, of course. And, I was a virgin till I got married and all those things, and it was beneficial for my life in a lot of ways, but then also hindered me in a lot of ways as well. One of the emotions that I learned about as I started to like allow myself to really become emotionally intelligent was pleasure. Now, I don't know what church you grew up in, but pleasure was
Yes.
definitely not on the topic of conversation, okay? And I'm specifically talking about sexual pleasure, because there's pleasure in a whole bunch of different ways, but I'm specifically talking about sexual pleasure. And I didn't access that part of myself. And when I first was exploring this emotion, I was just like kind of ashamed, because I was like, What am I supposed to do with this? We're not really supposed to feel this." Like, and what I had to learn is that if I want to experience joy, pleasure is actually a branch on the tree of joy. So that is another avenue of joy that I get to experience through pleasure. And it was very awkward for me. I have to be very honest. But once I was able to like kind of get comfortable with it and really talk to myself, like, okay, well, why am I feeling this? Where is this coming from? Blah, 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 all this stuff. I really allow myself to like really, really experience pleasure. And y'all, it's been very different. It's like sex is different only because I allow myself to feel a certain way about it. Anyways, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. Let's go back to the definition. The first part we just talked about, which is awareness and understanding. The next part of the emotional intelligence definition is management. It's management. If you are lucky enough to be able to go to the first part, which is like, hey, I do have awareness. I do know what my emotions are, and I do have a level of understanding. You might get stuck here in the management or the regulation phase. And I think a lot of people get stuck here. This is the part of emotional intelligence that we teach toddlers. And I only could tell you that for certain is because I'm teaching my toddlers that. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I am teaching them that just because you feel anger doesn't mean you should respond in a negative way, right? And being able to regulate or self soothe. And that management part can be difficult if you were never really taught how to self soothe, how to regulate when you feel emotions, negative or positive. The next part of the definition, of course, is to use it or to articulate your emotion. You have to be able to express your wants, your needs, your boundaries, your capacity. Is not just enough to know your emotions, to self soothe, but also to express those emotions is a big part of emotional intelligence. All right, so let's recap this section. Emotional intelligence is the ability to understand, manage, and use your own emotions in a positive way. Now, the positive way is what we trying to get to, but most of the time we start in the negative way. And I want to take a minute and talk to you guys about how we typically respond to our emotions in a more negative way. And I have a whole list, but I'm only going to read a few that stood out to me. The first one is suppression. Now raise your hand if this is you. This is me raising my hand. Suppression is ignoring the emotions and bottling up, right? Just think about pushing like the trash when the trash is really, really full. Instead of taking it out, okay, I'm not talking to myself here. Instead of taking it out, what do? We just stuff it all the way down, right? And then we put more trash on top. And then if we're strong enough, we stuff it all the way down. That is what suppression is. Sometimes we feel certain emotions, good or bad, and we're like, can't feel them, can't deal with them right now. I'm just going to stuff them all down. But what happens is that bag ends up breaking or it ends up overflowing on top. And that's not what we want to practice. The next negative response we have to um, our emotions is aggression, which can be, yelling, screaming, just getting real loud, right? It's like, I feel anxious. So instead of dealing with the fear of what I'm dealing with or, whatever my mind is reminiscing on, I'm just going to snap on people, right? We're in the store and they just snapping on you. No emotional regulation, none whatsoever. The next one is passive aggressive. This is about indirect communication and procrastination. This is also me. I'm not gonna lie, y'all. I was reading this list and I was like, I have a lot of these. Still working on it. A lot of them I have been able to like move forward and like, okay, recognize it and say, okay, this is how I need to do better. But I'm not gonna hold you. I'm not gonna hold you. I showed up a couple of times on this list. So perfect example, right? Let's say you're dealing with anxiety. There is a fear about something that you are afraid that makes you feel anxious. So let's say like it's a work assignment, right? And instead of dealing with that emotion and saying, "Oh, I'm afraid. What does this fear mean? What can I do about this fear? Who can I ask to help me with this fear and this anxiousness?" Right? What prayer do I need to pray? Instead of doing that, what you do is procrastinate. You leave all the pressure for a small amount of time, right? Like maybe a couple of hours before the presentation. You do as much as you can, and then you feel relief right after. Because feeling the pressure a week before or 2 weeks before is literally going to make you anxious, which makes you feel like out of control. So instead of dealing with the anxiety for those 2 weeks, you just decide, hey, I'm just wait about like 4 hours before. I'm gonna deal with all the pressure in that moment, and then I'll feel relief once it's over, which is a bad habit. That's just an example of passive aggressiveness. Of course, then you have indirect communication. Maybe they're sarcastic, right? The people who are sarcastic, they may be passive aggressive or have emotions. Not all the time. Sometimes it's like in a joking way. They're just trying to be jokeful, or whatever. But sometimes when it comes to like you trying to have an emotional conversation and the person just can't be serious, they only be sarcastic, right? You're being passive aggressive. There's probably emotion that you're not addressing or don't know how to address. The next one is avoidance, which I think is similar to suppression, but I liked that they mentioned distraction when it comes to avoidance. So what that may look like is, you have to have a conversation with your spouse, right? Or deal with your finances or whatever like that. And you just binge Netflix or you just shop or you just, talk on the phone with your girlfriend for hours and hours and hours, knowing dang well you got a whole bunch of stuff to do, right? So that's distraction. Another one is projection. Remember, these are negative ways we respond to our emotions. This is blaming others for your emotions. You're shifting your emotional responsibility to somebody else. Our emotions are our emotions, and we have to take 100% ownership for them. Yeah, it doesn't mean that people on the outside aren't like, creating scenarios or whatever that makes us feel a certain way, but we have to take ownership of that feeling. Like, oh, I feel pissed off, I feel angry. Like I feel. So with projection, you take that I and you turn it into a you. You are making me angry, or you are making me feel ashamed, or you are making me feel anxious, or right? So that is what projection is all about. You're blaming other people for your own emotions. Um, the next one is over dependence on others. This one I don't think we talk about enough. And it's including seeking constant validation and the inability to self-soothe. So all these are like we don't know how to self-soothe. But some people, when they have certain emotions, they don't go within themselves. They go outward. They go seek validation. They cling on to their spouse, or they cling on to their mother, or they cling on to whoever they need to cling on to soothe them instead of learning to self-soothe. Again, I have two toddlers. I love them to death. I really want to, soothe them as much as I can. I'm their mother. However, if I don't teach them how to calm themselves down by themselves when they're 25 or 35 and they're married and have kids and have families, they're going to have a really difficult time. It's really important. It's really important that we learn how to soothe ourselves. It's not to say that you can't have people to go to like, vent and to feel better and stuff like that. But if that is your main source, if that's your go-to, then that is a problem. Especially in marriage when you think about it, right? If they keep going to that spouse with all their emotions, imagine the burden that you're putting on your spouse. And listen, I know the fairy tale says, love and till death do us part and all this stuff. But the reality is that can be a lot for one person to deal with every emotion that you have going on. And the thing is, emotions, especially unmanaged, are really raw. They're kind of gross, right? And if you're not careful when you bring in your raw emotions to your partner, you can really hurt them because you haven't really even tried to work it out yourself or soothe yourself. So it's very important that you don't have an overdependence on your spouse where every emotion you feel, you're bringing it to them. That's a negative way to deal with your emotions because you do have to learn how to self soothe. The last one I think is common also is just the overreaction. It's like, you just start to exaggerate. You ever met somebody who gets flustered and they just start lying more? I'm like, why are you lying? Or why are you making this a bigger deal than it is? What's going on? Or they might catastrophize, where it's like, oh, the world's gonna end. If they feel anxious, especially with anxiety, like, Lord, you just started with a little fear about this, your finances, and it turned into you living on the street. How did we get there? How did we get there? Like, it's crazy. But it's very true. Like we start to exaggerate, or we start to catastrophize and make things like a big catastrophe, and it doesn't have to be. So those are just a few of the ways that we respond to our emotions in a negative way. And we want to take ourselves from these negative responses that we're typically living in to a more positive, healthy response, which is increasing your emotional intelligence, which is what this episode is all about. So now that we have an understanding of the definition of emotional intelligence, we also now have an understanding of the negative ways we respond. The next part I want to talk to you guys about is why is this important to our marriage? Now, I want to give you guys a little bit background when I talk about why this is important to our marriage. So, as I mentioned before a little bit, I grew up in an emotionally suppressed environment. This basically means that emotions were not allowed in our home space, specifically negative emotions. So that was sadness, that was anger, anxiety, fear, things like that. You definitely was not allowed to be weak or like humiliated. If you felt humiliated or disgusted, like all these different things, like you definitely was not allowed to feel these emotions. The perfect example of this is that when my parents first got a divorce, right? They had separated when I was like in elementary school, but they were like in the process of divorce when I got to middle school, like right in the beginning. And it was disgusting. Let's just be honest. It was trash. Like it was terrible. And at that time, I didn't know what I was experiencing, but I was experiencing depression. I remember I slept through the entire summer. Like I slept so much that my mom thought I was pregnant. Like she was convinced that I was pregnant. But I was really depressed. And I also went to school late every single day. Every single day. Now, here's the kicker. My school was across the street. Like, I'm not even joking. Anybody who's in Miami who knows where Horseman is, this is my house. My school was across the street, and I was late to school every single day. I would get to class, I would not participate. They even gave me detention for it. And, my mom had to come out to the school, and they found out that I was going through a divorce. And she still gave me detention, by the way. I was pissed off. I was like, why? My parents going through a divorce, right? I had to clean up listen, okay, I got to stay focused. Let me get back to the story. The point is, I was like 11 or 12 years old. I was severely depressed, and I was showing signs of it. Now, in hindsight, as a counselor, I'm looking back, I'm like, "Ooh, that baby girl was depressed. She was depressed." And at the worst of it, I remember, writing a letter and like just feeling like I don't want to be on this earth. Like, I just remember feeling that deep darkness of despair. Like, if you've ever experienced depression, you know that there's this like hole that you can't get out of. It's so weird to explain, but it's just like a darkness. It feels like it's sucking you in. And I remember writing a letter explaining like everything that I was feeling and explaining, why I was sad and all these things, and just taking like a handful of like sleepy Tylenol. Now I'm 12, so I ain't got no hard drugs, So to me, that was the best way to do this, right? And I slept some more, and I slept and I slept. Like, I don't know how long I slept for, but what happened was my aunt found the note, and she told my mom. And but again, I'm in a household where sadness, let alone depression, is not accepted, right? Either it's completely dismissed or it's spiritualized. It's like overly spiritualized. And my mom, I remember when my mom finally talked to me about it, she's like, "Oh, I know we're going through a lot, but you just have to be strong, and everything's gonna work out, and Jesus is gonna take care of us and all that stuff." And I'm just like, yeah, okay, still sad, right? So even at that young age, I learned that I just have to get over it. Like, there's nothing that's going to happen to help me fix this, right? So imagine that is the house that I'm growing up in, and that is what I'm constantly practicing when it comes to my emotions. I'm constantly practicing, put your emotions away, be strong, be resilient, over and over and over and over and over again. So I come into a marriage where that is what I've been learning this whole time. So that's exactly what I'm going to be bringing. I'm going to be bringing a lack of emotional intelligence. And what I realized is that it was causing a lot of problems, because whenever my husband asking me, "How do you feel about this?" or "What do you want? What do you think?" I didn't know. I didn't understand boundaries. I didn't understand capacity. I didn't understand how to articulate my wants and my needs or my desires. I didn't know. Everything was just, "I'm fine. Oh, I'm good. No, I'm good. I'm good." Right? If somebody hurts me or if somebody does something, it's just like, "I'm good. I'm good." Right? And my answer to that was like, "No, don't worry. I'm just going to be resilient. I'll just be stronger, after this." And that didn't work for too long, because, like the analogy of the trash can, I kept putting my emotions and just stuffing them down. Like, every time I'll get a new set of emotions or however I would feel, I would just stuff them down, stuff them down. Guess what happened? It overflowed, and it was disgusting. I was very passive aggressive, didn't know how to express my emotions. So I just was just passive aggressive, like more sarcastic or more, cold shoulder, silent treatment. Like, "Oh, that's how people are going to know that I'm upset." Girl, it don't work. It don't work. Nobody knows or nobody cares. So there's three main ways how, when I learned to have a higher level of emotional intelligence, how it affected my marriage. And this is how to benefit your marriage as well. The first way is I was able to communicate better. Once you are able to identify your own emotions, there's clarity in every conversation that you have. For example, let's say that the finances makes me anxious. It makes me worried, right? Instead of procrastinating, instead of, making excuses to my husband as to why I can't do the budget, I can say, every time I try to do the budget, I get really anxious. I feel really worried and scared. Is there something we could do to work on this? Do you see how there's so much clarity in this conversation just because I was able to identify my own emotions? Now, if you want to take it a step further, maybe I could figure out a way to mitigate those emotions. Maybe I could figure out a way to like self-soothe. Like, dang, if I'm feeling anxious, let me figure out why. Why is it every time I try to do the budget, I feel anxious? Is there a fear of poverty? Is there, you know what I'm saying? I can problem solve. You can actually work through things and communicate better when you have a better understanding of your emotions. You're also able to articulate your limitations, your capacity, things that you can't do because you have a better awareness of, your emotions. The second way it's going to benefit your relationship is conflict resolution, of course. Communication is more of the easy part. Conflict resolution, when things get ugly, right? That I feel statement is really going to help you, right? I feel humiliated. It's not that you feel bad. You don't just feel bad. What was it about what your spouse did that made you feel the way you feel? I feel humiliated. When you're able to identify that, as I mentioned before, we have a place to start from. We can focus on the problem being the problem. So many times in conflict resolution, what happens is that we're talking around the problem. We're talking about, oh, how this mama said this and how this happened this, but we are not really focused on the problem. When you have a higher level of emotional intelligence, you can stick to the problem like this is what it is. How do we fix this? How do we resolve this? And then the last thing, of course, is empathy. And this is why in the beginning of this episode, I talked about how this is one of those things that it's an individual thing that you have to work on. Because before you can even take all this work and apply it to your marriage in regards to emotional intelligence, you have to be able to do it for yourself. And empathy is a byproduct of emotional intelligence. Because what happens is, and I'll tell you for myself, I realized that dang, when all these emotions and the cat was out of the bag, right? And I just started to experience all these emotions, I realized that they're kind of gross, right? Especially when they're raw and they're very, very, very human. And because I had that understanding of how human, how complex, how raw these emotions are, I start to see other people in a different light where I'm like, oh, wait, that person is also experiencing this level, these emotions. They're also trying to deal with these emotions. And specifically in marriage, when my husband comes home and, maybe he's a little snappy, right? And, he had a hard day at work, I'm able to extend a level of empathy and understanding where he's like, you know what? If I had a hard day at work, I would probably be a little snappy. And instead of responding with more snappiness, which is going to create a cycle of hurt, I can show grace. I can show empathy. I'm like, you know what, babe, I'm sorry. Maybe did you have a hard day? And talk about it and bring it up. That way their walls could be down. So those are the three main ways that this will benefit your marriage. You'll communicate better, you'll have better conflict resolution, and you'll be able to extend empathy to your spouse. So we've talked about what emotional intelligence is, negative ways to handle your emotion, and how emotional intelligence is important for your marriage. The last thing we're going to talk about, what we're here for, is how do we gain emotional intelligence? Now, if you have gone through this episode and you realize, dang, I'm kind of jacked up, that's okay. That was me too. But the good news is that once you put these things into practice, you actually can gain a better level of emotional intelligence. It doesn't matter if you're 6 or 65, right? These are things we're supposed to learn as toddlers and as we're raised by our family, but sometimes that doesn't happen. But that's okay. Even if you're 35, 45, 55, you can still learn this skill. It is very important for you to learn this skill and it will benefit your life. How do we gain emotional intelligence and apply it to our lives and our marriages? This play by play that I'm going to give you is coming from my own personal experience. If you want the more professional, way to kind of start identifying your emotions, I would recommend the book Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown. I would also suggest that you purchase the hardcover book. It is a beautiful book. You put that thing on your mantle and you access it when you need to. Like if you look behind me right now, if you're watching me, you'll see right here Atlas of the Heart top shelf. Because the thing about Atlas of the Heart is it really helps you give you language for emotion. It is going to break down all the major emotions, okay, that counselors have noticed in their practice, just different ways. So I would definitely recommend Atlas of the Heart. Even softer landing before you get to Atlas of the Heart is just a feelings wheel. This is very simple. You can print it, you can post it, make it a magnet at your house. And, even when you're getting in arguments with your spouse, right? Maybe you need to stop and pause and be like, wait, right now I'm getting really angry, but what type of anger am I feeling? The feelings will helps you to really, again, gain that language. So you can say, maybe I feel let down, maybe I feel betrayed, maybe I feel disrespected or ridiculed, right? So the feelings way is just a simple way for you to really learn that emotional language and increase your emotional intelligence. So, how do you gain emotional intelligence? The first thing I would say is you have to be honest. I mentioned this a little bit in the beginning. Honesty is going to be so important when it comes to emotional intelligence because when you have those feelings, you can't push them away now. You can't distract yourself. You have to sit with them. You have to sit with those emotions and be honest about them. This for me probably was the hardest part of it. For example, I remember when I was feeling like envious towards someone, like jealous, and I was just so confused. I was just like, "What is this? Why am I so like why do I feel this way towards this person?" And some people can't admit that. Some people really can't admit that they are feeling envious and jealous. Why? Maybe she's prettier than you. Maybe she has a better career than you. Maybe whatever the thing is, let's be honest about the emotion. The negative ones and the positive ones, my boy. Like, I am feeling envious. Because when you're able to do that, then you can address it. The second part I would say to that honesty is compassion. Like I mentioned before, these emotions are the very, very basic of human existence. I promise you. It's so raw and real. W- Follow any toddler. If you have a niece, a nephew, somebody, right? Those toddlers will show you what the real human race is like. Because what happens is toddlers, they have the emotions, they have not learned how to regulate them yet. They haven't learned how to manage them, regulate them, or articulate them. So they are moving purely off of impulses. If they're angry, they're going to throw something at you, right? If they are jealous or envious, they're going to snatch that toy, right? But we don't want to be 25-year-olds walking around as 3-year-olds throwing tantrums and things like that. So it's very important, I think, that after you're honest, that you're compassionate with yourself and understand, like, okay, this is a very, very human thing. Like, it's okay. I can work through this, right? Talk to yourself nicely. Be kind to yourself. The next step to gaining emotional intelligence is a game plan. In the therapy space, they call this a coping strategy, right? When I have this emotion, how am I going to deal with it? Am I going to deal with it in the negative way that I'm used to, suppressing, over dependence on other people, being a victim or projecting, blaming other people? How am I going to deal with these emotions? I need a game plan. When I feel envious, or am I going to send a nasty, sarcastic text to my girlfriends about, oh, that outfit didn't even look cute on you? No, girl, you jealous. I'm not saying that you have to tell everybody what you're going through, right? But acknowledge it for yourself. When I feel jealous, what am I gonna do? Maybe my jealousy is telling me, "Oh, I need to love myself a little bit more. I need to pamper myself a little bit more. I need to boost my self-worth and my self-confidence." Because the jealousy and the envy is telling me something's up. So what's the game plan or the coping strategy? The next step in increasing your emotional intelligence is finding a safe place to work out the ugly. And this does not have to be your spouse. I know a couple and they were going through some hard times and well, they were going through some tough times, like just emotionally. And I remember the wife saying, I really recommend that you get a counselor and you really work this out. And I just thought that was so mature of her because she was able to recognize within herself that she wasn't a safe place. Not because she, was like being toxic or anything, but because she was able to see that she is not best equipped to help her husband deal with these types of emotions. And I thought that was so very mature. If you are dealing with your emotions and you're trying to become more emotionally intelligent, you do need a place to work out these ugly emotions. And it doesn't have to be your spouse. Your spouse may not be able to handle all of that, or they may not be fully equipped. So you may need to find a counselor, or you may need to find a pastor or a really trusted friend. It does not have to be a counselor and it doesn't have to be your spouse. And I know specifically I'll mention here just for men, typically their emotions are their currency. So they're really not about to just share their emotions with anybody, especially not the deep dark ones, right? So men tend to feel comfortable amongst other men. if you're dealing with emotions, you're trying to become more emotionally intelligent and you need to work this out, then get around some other men who you feel like are safe, who you can tell them like, "You know what? I really feel betrayed. I feel like she betrayed me. Or I feel like she disrespected me." Whatever. And where you can work those emotions out. And for me, luckily, I was able to have I did work some things out with Junior. I'm also seeking counseling because 'cause I'm like, this emotion, I kinda wanna work it out with a professional who I feel like, is equipped to actually, giving me tools and stuff. I love my husband, but, he has limitations like we all do. Have a couple of friends that I can call where when I'm feeling that raw emotion that's unmanaged, that emotion that's unarticulated, right? I'm able to work it out with somebody. The next step to emotional intelligence is perseverance. All that resilience that you are using to dismiss your emotions, I need you to keep that same energy. Okay? I need you to keep the same energy to use that level of resilience and perseverance in continuing to strengthen your emotional intelligence, your emotional awareness, management skills, articulation skills. Because what happens is when the easy emotions come, it's going to feel easy. And you're going to be like, oh, yeah, I can do this. I can manage this. Okay, I feel a little bit of anxiety, but I have a coping strategy. I know what steps to do. I know how to work it out. But then there's going to be some harder emotions, and it's different for everyone, right? Where maybe you feel disgust. Mm. Maybe you feel shame, maybe envy or jealousy. Some that may be a hard emotion for some people to deal with. And what are you going to do then? Are you going to practice the negative way to handle your emotions? Or are you going to use some of that perseverance and that resilience to be able to work that emotional muscle? Hold on, my Haitian accent came in. Let me try it again. You're going to have to work that emotional muscle because there's definitely gonna be times where and even for me, where I have an emotion and I just I'm like, "Whoa, I cannot handle this. I cannot handle this." And sometimes in the meantime, for your pure survival, you're like, you have to do that, but you can't live in that state. You cannot keep doing that over and over and over and over and over again because you just end up your insides just become rotted, right? You just end up suppressing and numbing and all these different things. So it's very important that you have a level of resilience and perseverance to keep working the emotional muscle. You have to keep going. You have to keep practicing. You have to keep pushing through. The last thing I would say when it comes to emotional intelligence is definitely let your spouse in on the process. Let them know what's going on, right? And with whatever that you can share, try to articulate as best as you can because you don't want to leave your spouse in the dark and you don't want to keep them guessing. There's certain emotions that I'll speak for myself here where I dealt dealt slash dealing with deep rooted shame and repressed shame. Okay, shame I didn't even know existed. Shame that keeps coming up in different ways that I'm like, I thought I was done with this, but here we are again, right? So my husband's aware of it. He knows that I'm, dealing with it and how it shows up in our relationship. And I would tell him, I'm like, hey, this is where this is showing up. I let him know, like, hey, can you be mindful about this area of our lives and da da da, all these different things. And that gives him a little bit of relief. And also, like, he knows how to help me. He knows how to support me. He knows how to pray for me. So let your spouse in on what you're going through at the level that you're comfortable with. I'm not telling you to like, you have to fully expose yourself, especially when it comes to emotions. And especially if you repress your emotions, then you have to be able to like do that thing slowly. Right. You don't want to just the dam to break. If you're the type of person who have used your spouse as an emotional anchor, and you're learning to self-soothe, let them in on that process as well. Be like, hey babe, I didn't come to you because I want to try to work this one out on myself, like for myself. I want to try to self-soothe for myself. Different things like that. So just to wrap this segment up, how to gain emotional intelligence and apply it to your life. You have to have honesty, compassion, a game plan or coping strategy. You have to find a safe place to work out those ugly emotions or the raw emotions. And it does not have to be your spouse. You have to keep going. You have to keep working that muscle and work through the tough moments and let your spouse in on the process. Don't shut them out. So this topic is a big topic. And of course, I have resources for you guys in the show notes. So in the show notes, you're going to see a link to a blog by the Gottman Institute talking about emotional intelligence. It's going to help you explain it. You can read through it. I think they have a really good analogy on there about planes and stuff like that. So you can have a better understanding. Also, we have a BMT worksheet. This is something that I want to start implementing into what we do here at BMT because, as you know, it's really about resources, really about teaching, it's really about helping you guys have a better, thriving relationship. So we have a BMT worksheet on emotional intelligence. It's going to help you to kind of identify those negative ways that you're using your emotion and create a game plan for using it in a positive way, right? So that's the BMT worksheet. You're also going to find a link to the Atlas of the Heart by Brene Brown, which is what I talked about, which is going to help you widen your emotional language so that you can communicate them better. And then you're going to have the feelings wheel, which is something that you can print out, you can put it on your fridge, and that's just going to help you access very quickly your emotions on a deeper level. So all that is down there in the show notes. That is all that we have for you for this episode. We would love to end with a quote by Unknown, actually. It says, emotional intelligence is not about being emotional. It's about understanding and managing your emotions effectively. I love that. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Black Marriage Therapy. If you haven't yet, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Talk to you soon.